chasm that lay between us. How high the mountain I could not climb. In desperation, I turned to heaven and spoke your name into the night. Then through the darkness, your loving kindness tore through the shadows of my soul. The work is finished, the end is written. Jesus Christ, my living hope. Who could imagine so great a mercy? What heart could fathom such boundless grace? The God of ages stepped down from glory to wear my sin and bear my shame. The cross has spoken, I am forgiven. The King of Kings calls me his own. Beautiful Savior, I'm yours forever. Jesus Christ, my living hope. Hallelujah, praise the one who set me free. Hallelujah, death has lost its grip on me. You have broken every chain. There's salvation in your name, Jesus Christ, my living hope. Hallelujah, praise the one who set me free. Hallelujah, death has lost its grip on me. You have broken every chain. There's salvation in your name, Jesus Christ, my living hope. Jesus Christ, my living hope. Oh God, you are my living hope.
Welcome back. Thanks for joining us for our third session of our Missions Emphasis Weekend. Let's begin with the worship song.
I once was lost in darkest night, yet thought I knew the way. The sin that promised joy and light had led me to the grave. I had no hope that you would own, a rebel to your will. And if you had not loved me first, I would refuse you still. But as I ran my hell-bound race, indifferent to the cost, you looked upon my helpless state and led me to the cross. And I beheld God's love displayed. You suffered in my place. You stood for me. Now all I know is grace. Hallelujah. All I have is Christ. Hallelujah. Jesus is my life. Hallelujah. All I have is Christ. Hallelujah. Jesus is my life. Now, Lord, I would be yours alone and live so all my sin, the strength to follow your commands could never come from me. Oh, Father, use my ransom life any way you choose, and let my song forever be my only boast is you. Hallelujah. All I have is Christ. Hallelujah. Jesus is my life. Hallelujah. All I have is Christ. Hallelujah. Jesus is my life. All right. Thanks again for joining us. Dr. Russell Jung will now give to us the third session of our Missions Emphasis Weekend. Please enjoy.
Hi, Bread of Life. This is another session on the gifts of the Asian American Church. And again, my thesis is that our weaknesses, our personal weaknesses and our cultural weaknesses as Asians. Hi, Bread of Life. This is another session on the gifts of the Asian American Church. And again, my thesis is that our weaknesses, our personal weaknesses and our cultural weaknesses as Asians are a two-edged sword. They can be our weaknesses, but then if God can transform them and redeem them, he gives us gifts as strengths that we can boast in, but again, our gifts that we receive and then can give to the world as our ministry, as our mission, as Asian American Christians. Our gift of family could hurt us, could wound us, could make us, like me, a toddler who whines and complains, even as an adult, or it could be a gift that we could share, bonds of family that we could lend to others. Our cultural background of hard work and effort can be good in that we try to do the right thing, but really God also gives us with a simple heart, one that could follow him and could live simply so that we could better relate and minister to others. Today, I'm going to talk about another aspect of our Asian background, and that's our immigrant background. And in this moment, you may know that Asian Americans are under a state of siege. We're being attacked wantonly. Our elderly are really vulnerable. They've been pushed and shoved in the streets, and one in San Francisco has been killed. And that cuts really close to home because my 94-year-old mom used to live in that neighborhood. She used to walk all over that neighborhood. And some of my best friends lived on the block where the Thai American man was pushed and killed. And so it's also painful for me because I created an organization called Stop AAPI Hate to track the racism going on. And I've read thousands of incidents where Asian Americans have been horrendously and viciously harassed and beaten. I'm going to share with you some of the incidents now. And again, these are all cases that occurred to elderly. And it's sort of difficult to hear, but I want you to hear it. I want you to lament about what's going on across the nation and to experience it as Asians. God has gifted us with our Asian background. God has given us family who are Asians. We respect our elders, and this is what's happening to our elders. So I want you to feel it rather than dismissing it and to let the words wash over you. These are actual reports reported by elderly Asians in the US this past year. A customer began screaming at me for no reason while in line and correctly distanced at 6 feet. I'm mostly Chinese. My family's been in San Luis Obispo since 1860s, or 170 years. I'm fourth generation in San Luis Obispo, but guess I will never be an American. Waiting to cross the street, I felt something on my head, and it turned out to be spit all over my hair and back of my coat. I was repeatedly spit on by a big white guy. On my daily walk in my hometown Sausalito wearing a mask, a white woman yelled at me, "I hate Chinese people. Why do they come to this country?" when she passed me. I was stunned by her words and caused me to fear and to be more alert of my surroundings. My wife and I were taking a walk, minding our own business, when two dogs tried to attack us. When the woman owner came to us, she said, "The reason the dogs are afraid of you is because you eat dogs." Then said, "You need to go back where you came from." We were shocked to hear this. I was shopping and a child grabbed my arm. The child said I should go back to my country, and I was the reason his father died. Her mother came up and put her hand on my arm. She didn't try to help me. Bakersfield occasionally has ignorant people who make fun of how I talk and look and tell me to go home. But this is the scariest and saddest experience I've had in the US since about 1977. I was standing in the aisle at a hardware store when suddenly I was struck from behind. Video surveillance verified the incident in which a white male used his bent elbow striking my upper back. Subsequent verbal attacks occurred with, "Shut up, you monkey. F you, Chinaman. Go back to China. Bring that Chinese virus over here." Waiting to enter a pharmacy to get a prescription, a group of construction workers not doing social distancing made fun of the situation by mocking me, faking coughing, spitting, and making slant-eyed gesture, so I told them to cut it out. No one else called this person out. So these, again, are just a fraction of the thousands of incidents we've received in our website tracker. And again, it cuts close to home, and I know that many Chinese now are telling their elderly parents and grandparents to stay at home for fear that they may get attacked as well. You can see in our data that this is a common occurrence nationwide. We've received reports from every state, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. In California, a UCLA study showed that 7% of Asians experienced racism last year. 7% doesn't sound like much, but that's actually over 400,000 people, over 1,000 cases a day of hate against Asians. 8% are actually clear civil rights violations. We're mistreated at the workplace, we are barred from establishments, we're barred from transportation. About 15 to 20% are actually physical assaults. We're getting pushed and shoved, we're getting knifed, and a real high rate is that we're getting coughed and spat upon. And it's sort of a dehumanizing behavior. My own wife was running in Oakland, and someone actually blocked her path on the trail and coughed in her face. So I think they're weaponizing coronavirus. They think we're the source of the infection, so they want to reinfect us. We have a high rate of verbal harassment, and then shunning is when people deliberately avoid us. This verbal harassment isn't just microaggressions. Again, as you read, they're traumatic experience of being yelled at, having profanities and slurs slung at us. And we know that after we've surveyed our respondents, people are experiencing racial trauma, longer periods of depression, anxiety, and sleeplessness because of these racist attacks. So these aren't isolated incidents, it's widespread and pervasive. A lot of it happens in stores where we interact with the public now that we're sheltered in place. And you can see that Chinese are the primary targets of racism, but it's also an experience of racial profiling. If you look East Asian, you're more likely to get attacked. Koreans, Filipinos, Vietnamese, and Japanese are also attacked at high rates. In Los Angeles, a Latino man was punched and told to go back to China. And in Vancouver, an indigenous person was also punched and told to go back to China. So it is, racial profiling is triggering people to attack Asians. So it's widespread. And the question is, why is this biological virus, something that doesn't discriminate, being associated with Asians and leading to racism? And I think there are three clear factors. The political rhetoric last year, the use of the term Chinese virus really did cement in people's minds. It racialized the virus so that the virus wasn't biological, but was a Chinese virus, and it stigmatized the people. Chinese were the ones who brought the virus. So the repeated connection of Chinese people with the virus gave people implicit and bias and made people have an automatic reaction whenever they saw Asian people that they thought of the virus and became fearful. This political rhetoric was then reaffirmed by media representations. Social media went viral with pictures of Chinese people eating bats as a source of the disease. Whenever newspapers initially reported on the virus, they would always show Chinese people in masks. That re-invoked the yellow peril fear, the stereotype that Asians are a threat to the West, that Asians would come and attack and invade the West with their hordes and also bring their diseased bodies to the West. So whenever diseases did come from Asia, that fear was re-invoked. And so then people would scapegoat and attack Asians for bringing the disease, and then they would also initiate racist policies. Here in the 1870s, the diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy were seen to emanate out of Chinatown, bringing specters of death. And because of this fear of disease, and because Chinese were seen as taking away white people's jobs, and because Chinese were seen as unassimilable pagans, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, seeing us as foreigners, outsiders who should remain outside the American borders. This use of disease to be racist and create policies that hurt Chinese and Asians continued in 1900 with the bubonic plague. It was found in Chinatown, so health officials roped off Chinatown. They allowed white people to leave, but they kept Chinese people segregated to get the disease. In Santa Ana, California, and in Honolulu, those Chinatowns were burned down because of the bubonic plague. So you could see the bubonic plague has eerie parallels to today. A disease comes, Chinese are scapegoated for the disease, and health policies are created to exclude, quarantine. On Angel Island Immigration Center, they were health policies detained Chinese and then were used as a reason to deport Chinese. Not only were the parallels that racist policies were instituted, but during those periods, there were also thousands of interpersonal attacks. In the 19th century, there were over 300 Chinese settlements that were displaced mobs would actually drive them out. These weren't individuals, these were entire communities. Again, my own family's community, we lived in a fishing village of 200 in Monterey. That community in 1906 was actually burned down, and the whole community was driven off and evicted. And so my great-grandparents had to flee to San Francisco Chinatown. So the eerie parallels is that, my great-grandparents faced racism, a fire burned down, and so they had to retreat to San Francisco Chinatown. I asked my 94-year-old mom, you see the racist attacks now, what would you do? And she said, I guess I'll just shop on Clement Street, a Chinese neighborhood. And so over a century later, after Chinese were repeatedly displaced, we're back in sort of a similar situation. We're attacked so much so that my mom doesn't feel free to walk around anymore, but is relegated to a Chinese segregated neighborhood. So you could see the racialization of COVID-19. You have a general truth that the virus is from China. Political rhetoric then associates the virus Chinese and Chinese with the virus. People then wearing masks are the primary media representation of the disease. And so people began to associate Chinese people wearing masks are very clearly the disease people. And so the disease gets racialized. And then what happens is people racially profile. Everybody in the US has a schema. The schema helps us to process information. It's the way our brains are hardwired to work. If you see a growling dog, you're not going to stop and think, there's a dog, it's barking, its teeth are bared, it's got sharp teeth. You automatically process all that information and run away. You get threatened and you run. That's how schema operates. You perceive information, you make automatic assumptions. And in the US, the first things people perceive are your age, your gender, and your race. And when they see you with racial characteristics, they'll associate you with other behaviors, other characteristics. And then they make you automatic assumptions. Oh, you're Chinese. Oh, you're wearing a mask. You must be a disease carrier. This is the implicit bias that everybody has. I too, even though I'm an ethnic studies professor, have these racial stereotypes that I hold in my head. I make automatic assumptions when I see people. And if we see people and we feel threatened by people, then we go into flight or fight mode. And you see that's what's happening. People are going to flight mode and they're shunning Asians, and they're going to fight mode where they're attacking Asians. So we're not saying everybody is racist, but we're arguing that everybody has racialized perspectives and they act out of their racial perspectives. We have implicit biases. And I'm telling you all this during a talk on missions. You'll see that all this discussion about how Asians are being mistreated will eventually actually become one of our gifts. But what's happening now, just to give you understanding of the sociology of race, is in America, it's primarily thought of in terms of white-black race relations. When we talk about America's racial history, it's about whites and blacks. And usually whites are seen as being on top and with more wealth, more power, more status, and blacks are seen as being on the bottom. So most people, seeing that whites are considered superior, pursue whiteness. It's not like Asians want to be white, but they want the status of whites. They want the power of whites. They want the wealth of whites. And so to become white, we often avoid becoming black. We become anti-black. Asian Americans, though, when we talk about racial relations, are often invisible. We're omitted because we're neither white nor black. And so if you ever see surveys about who voted, they never talk about Asians because they primarily focus on whites and blacks. Asians, though, are neither white or black, and so we're not racialized in the same way blacks are. We're not seen as minorities like blacks. Instead, people see us as minorities in a different way, on an insider-outsider binary, a spectrum where some people are on the inside, belong to America, fit in, are seen as native, and other people are seen as outsiders who don't belong. In some periods of time, we're the model minority as Asians. We're seen as crazy rich Asians that everybody loves. And sometimes in other periods of war, in periods of epidemic, in periods of economic downturn, we're pushed and seen as outsiders who don't belong. And you can see that operating. Last year, we were attacked hundreds of times, and people repeatedly say, "Go back to China, you effing chink," because they don't see us as belonging. They say you brought the disease, and therefore they see us as the outsiders coming in, invading. Policies also exclude us. Last year, the US banned Chinese researchers and students, banned immigration visas so that Chinese families couldn't reunify, banned refugee resettlement or cut refugee resettlement, cut H-1B visas so Asian workers couldn't come in, banned WeChat, banned racial sensitivity training. So even this actual talk was banned last year, and my talks to federal employees were canceled. But you could see Asians are treated as a perpetual foreigner at this moment, and that's why we're experiencing racism. It's not because we're the model minority that people are attacking us, it's because they see us as not belonging. Because we're outsiders, people view that it's okay to push and shove us, to cough and spit in us. It's okay to treat us subhumanly so that we actually kill your elderly. So this perpetual foreigner is really dangerous. It's actually killing us, and it's difficult to bear. That's why most people want to gain whiteness to avoid the lower status, and most people want to gain insider status so that we could gain belonging. But right now, a lot of us feel like people don't accept us in America. Now, this racism has had huge impacts on the community, and you can see how COVID-19 has exposed America's racial disparity. Asian Americans are the group with the worst mental health outcomes right now during COVID-19. And those who experience racism have even higher rates of depression, stress, anxiety, and somatic symptoms. We have 4 stressors. We're worried about getting the disease because we often live in multi-generational households. We're worried about bringing the disease and spreading it to our elders. We have economic issues, and we're worried about racism. And as a result, again, we have high rates of mental issues. Racism has clearly impacted the joblessness rate of Asian Americans. Maybe, I don't know if you experience it in Torrance, but in Asian ethnic enclaves, people were avoiding Chinatowns. People weren't going to nail salons. And so our small businesses closed earlier, and then we laid off Asian American working in the service sector, hospitality sector a lot more. So Asian Americans now have the second highest rate of unemployment behind African Americans. The COVID-19 pandemic has devastated a lot of Chinatowns and a lot of ethnic enclaves. And finally, racism has led to anti-immigrant policies. We said in history, America has passed exclusionary policies against Asians. They kept us out. And in World War II, they incarcerated Japanese Americans. After 9/11, a lot of Muslims, South Asians were attacked. They were detained and deported. And last year, again, Trump initiated all these visa bans that changed the migration impacts of the migration policies of the US that hurt Chinese people especially. He cut WeChat, which is the primary way Chinese communicate. Some Chinese even worship. They hold church over WeChat, but that was cut. So our freedom of religion was actually cut as WeChat got banned. So you can see the perpetual foreigner stereotype has really hurt us, and the community has resisted because in every case of resistance, Chinese have always fought back. And so we have youth campaigns, we have 13-year-old girls holding rallies, we have large Black Asian rallies working together, and we have huge social media campaigns that have really amplified the issue. So even though we're going through a really difficult time, the good news is that the Asian American is standing up for themselves. Jeremy Lin is a real model. Even though he had an experience of slur, he didn't shame or call out his perpetrator, but instead he forgave him and he expressed his anger and hurt, but then he also felt sad for how hateful his perpetrator was. and sought to reconcile with him rather than to shame him. But what I want to really talk about is that Asian Americans are seen as a perpetual foreigner. It's seen clearly in how people cough and yell at us, "Where are you from?" as if you don't belong, and "Go back to China." And it's hard for us to accept that people don't like us. It's actually shaming for us to think that we don't belong, because in a shame-based society, you really want to fit into the group. In a collective society, you want to belong to the collective. But it doesn't seem like at this point, America accepts Asians. And that's really painful, the pain of foreignness. In First Chronicle, it says, "We're strangers and foreigners, as were all our ancestors. Our days on earth are like a shadow without hope." And that's how it is for a lot of immigrants, especially refugees, that they're rootless. They don't have any hope because they have no security, especially, again, in the olden days when you lived off the land and you had no land. It seems like you have no economic security. Being foreign, being in exile means, like, for me, a real sense of being in limbo and not feeling secure. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories quickly of when I was actually a foreigner in China, and I taught in China for a year. But because I was raised as American, I had to go there and experience a whole new way of being, lots of different norms and expectations. And we call it anomie, not being able to fit into the expectations and norms creates a real disorientation. For example, they didn't have hot water. So back then when I was in China, I was actually taught in Wuhan, China, where the coronavirus came from. And in Wuhan, it's one of the furnaces of China, but there's no air conditioning back then and there was no heating. And so we had no cold water during the winter, and we had no hot water during the winter. And so we wouldn't bathe. I would go weeks without bathing because I'd be layered of clothes and no one could smell me. And I didn't want to take a bath because it was too cold. But finally I gave in and went to one of the bathhouses. And it's really scary because if you don't know how the bathhouse operates, and if you don't speak Chinese well, or you can't read the signs, you have no idea of what to do. And so I would walk in, and I was afraid of entering the wrong room because I couldn't read the signs. I didn't know, should I bring my own soap? Do they provide soap? And then they have these large pools, and I go in there, and people are scrubbing each other on the back. And I'm wondering, am I supposed to go and scrub another person's back? It's just, again, really difficult and scary to operate. So again, you try to avoid all these strange situations where you have to go to bathhouses. Or one time I went to a hot spring and the attendant kept on yelling at me. And one time it was because he kept on pointing at my shorts. And I guess I brought in these baggy shorts, which were inappropriate. And so I had to rent these little Speedo shorts. And then I was about to step in and he yelled at me again. And apparently I was supposed to wash myself before I entered the hot springs. And then I'm about to get in, and then he yelled at me even again because I was going into the old person's springs instead of going to this other springs. So foreignness is really difficult because you have no idea how the world operates, and you're sort of shocked. I'll give you two more quick examples. We didn't know what to do with our garbage. Right? In the US, you know how to put away your garbage, but we had no idea, like, what do we do with our garbage? Do we put it out? Who picks it up? What time? When? And again, if you don't speak the language, you're really stuck. And so all this garbage accumulates because you're sort of clueless. And so it's really hard living in a new country, in a new place. If you've experienced sometimes, even when you're traveling, your whole body shuts down. You don't even go to the bathroom when you're in a new country. I'll give you my one last story about being a foreigner. I know I'm going on too long. But in China, we would go to these dances. And back then, people didn't dance with the opposite sex. So guys would dance with guys and girls would dance with girls. And they would have these sort of ballroom dancing scenarios. It wasn't free dancing. And so I would go to the dance, and I'm standing with all these grad students. I was a young teacher. And this grad student comes up to me and goes, "Hey, Russell, you want to dance?" And I say, "No, go away." And he goes, "No, really, I want to dance." And I go, "Dance with that guy." And he goes, "I want to dance with you." And I go, "Oh, stop it. Just get away from me," right? Because I'm just not used to dancing with guys. But then another guy who was like a lot taller than me came down and said, "Hey, Russell, you want to dance?" And I looked up at him and I said, "I guess so." And so he grabbed me, and he it was a polka. So it was this fast dance. We were trotting around. And so he led, of course. So he's just sort of swinging me around really, really rapidly, so much so that eventually he swept me off my feet. And I was sort of like flying around like a rag doll. I was going, "Woo, this is sort of fun," And so again, being in a situation of not knowing what to do, sometimes it's terrifying, but sometimes it can turn out to be sort of fun, and you get swept off your feet. All this is to say is, when you're a foreigner, you live in a stage of normlessness, not knowing the expectations, and it's really hard. They found that suicide rates go up really high in periods of normlessness. It's like when people go to college, they don't know how to act, they don't know their identity. There's high rates of suicide during college, or in periods of fast social, cultural change, people don't know how to act, and so there's higher rates of suicide. So it's actually, again, really disrupting and hard. So being a foreigner just itself is an existential problem, and you have to remember, wow, maybe my parents went through all this period of limbolessness, of exile, of not knowing expectations, of being deaf and mute and not being able to talk to others, not being able to express yourself, not being able to understand what people are saying. It's really, really difficult. And to spend your entire life as a foreigner, never fitting in, is really hard. It's a sad way of being. I'm going to argue this weakness of being foreigners, for which Asians are facing racist attack, this experience of being a foreigner where you feel you're in limbo and never fit in, this experience of being a foreigner and being always not having a home, is actually something we need to reclaim. That this foreigner status is actually a gift of God. In 1 Peter 2, it says, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you weren't a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify the God on the day he visits us." This is the word of the Lord. So Peter says to the Christians, you are foreigners and exiles. Accept it. Adopt that identity. Even though people may act racistly towards you, even though you may be mistreated, even though you may never feel like you belong, adopt that identity while you're here on earth. And if you do, you will receive the gifts of God. And let me explain to you, as I embrace this sense of foreignness, what I've learned from my refugee neighbors, and when I think about my ancestors, these are the things that God has gifted us as foreigners. First of all, as foreigners, the foreigner has God's special attention. In Matthew 25, Jesus gave the parable and said, "The king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father.'" This is a parable of the sheep and the goats. And he says to the sheep, "Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world, because I was a stranger and you invited me in." So the stranger has a special place for Jesus. Those sheep who take care of the stranger get to go to heaven. Jesus himself said, "I was the actual stranger." So among the strangers, that's where Jesus resides. And if we serve the strangers, we're serving Jesus. So like the widow, like the orphan, the foreigner has God's special attention. He cares for us. Like the prisoner, like the blind who needs to be healed, God has come to save us. And so the more we adopt the foreigner status, the more we acknowledge, wow, God has saved us, lives among us. This is a refugee family from Burma who actually, again, because they were seen as being Chinese, they were actually slashed in the face, including the two kids, because they were perceived as being Chinese, even though they're from Burma. They were strangers in the United States, and God really does, despite the attacks on them, God loves these strangers in a special way. He has a special heart for those who are marginalized. And I think if we see that, wow, God really cares for the marginalized, maybe I should adopt the identity of the marginalized better than being the rich young ruler who doesn't get the special attention that these guys get. I think as we reclaim that foreigner status, we will learn not to oppress a foreigner because we know how it feels like to be foreigners because we were foreigners once ourselves. I think the more we actually feel what it's like to be an outsider right now, to actually stop and think, wow, people are attacking Asian elderly, like my grandmother, like my parents, because they don't think we belong. When people see me, they may spit on me because they just want to oppress us. The more we feel that experience of being mistreated and seen as being strange and different, then we could feel for others who are similarly treated. We could feel for maybe people at the borders who are detained. Maybe we would feel for other people who look different because we know what it feels like ourselves, so we extend that empathy for others. That's a gift to feel. Again, I said I was raised and I'm really critical and harsh and unfeeling, but because I've had these experiences, I think God has gifted me with a greater empathy the more I grow and the more I get in touch with how I have been mistreated for being different. As you understand what it feels like to be an outsider, to not have a home, you learn to show hospitality to strangers. And in fact, you could show hospitality to angels without even knowing it. So if you're a foreigner and have received the hospitality of others, then maybe, and felt at home, then maybe you could extend that to others. So again, when we spent some time in Taiwan, we didn't know how to interact with people or how to, again, do the garbage. We were really thankful for the host who took care of us and said, this is how you put out the garbage. This is how you shop for these types of clothes. And so Chinese families may not be super hospitable to others, but they're super hospitable to their families, right? And to people whom they know. So when we were in Taiwan, I met this relative of my close friend. And because I was really helpful to my friend, the family felt really indebted to me and were really hospitable to me. So this is a pomelo. And the story is like, if you say, oh, I really like pomelo, the next day your relatives would bring you a dozen pomelos just because you like it. They shower you with gifts and hospitality to make you feel welcome. And that's how I felt when I was in Taiwan with the aunt of my friend. And so the aunt said, oh, we didn't know how to get our teeth cleaned. So we asked her for a dentist. And she said, my husband's a dentist. Come in for a checkup. And I go, okay. So her husband cleans all our teeth. And then she says, it's okay, you don't have to pay. I go, okay, well, that's really nice of you. Thank you. And I said, we also need to get some winter clothes because it's getting cold. And so then she took us down the block and told us where to buy clothes, but then she paid for it, right? And so she's this incredible host who's not only cleaned our teeth, but then clothed us. We were the strangers and they took us in. We were naked without warm jackets and she clothed us. And then, I don't know, we're not thinking, we're sort of clueless to go, She goes, where do you want to go in Taiwan? And we go, oh, we want to go to that, the Taroko Gorges. And she goes, oh, we have an extra home in the Taroko Gorge. And she goes, you can stay there. And so we were homeless and she gave us a home. And so we went there and she shows up and she's like riding this little scooter and she gives us this little motorcycle ride back to her house from the train station. And again, she was totally hospitable, clothing us, cleaning our teeth, giving us a new home. And we never knew her before. She took in the stranger and demonstrated Jesus's lavish love. She showed hospitality. And I think that's made us feel welcome, make us feel loved. And I think as we understand what it is like to be a foreigner, to be new to a place, we know how to shower hospitality to others. And I think Bread of Life, that's one of your ministries. Whenever a guest comes to your church, shower them with the hospitality that Chinese can bestow on people. Consider them an insider as part of the family and treat them royally. I think this is a gift of the Chinese church, is that hospitality that we show family and friends who come from afar. Not only do we have empathy for the foreigner and show hospitality to the foreigner, but if you feel like a foreigner, you'll want justice for the foreigner. And the Old Testament laws had lots of rules about taking care of the foreigner. For example, you're not supposed to glean everything from your fields. You're not supposed to harvest everything, but instead you're supposed to leave grapes, and leave them for the poor and the foreigner. And he says, I'm your God, listen to me, because God cares for the poor, God cares for the foreigner, so you should too. And so part of our justice is to make sure that the poor and foreigner are taken care of. And even in Leviticus later on, he says, you're supposed to give a tithe, and that tithe goes to the poor and the foreigner. So it's this institutionalized policy that it's sort of like the taxes should go to the poor and the foreigner. So seek justice, seek policies that welcome in refugees, seek justice that treat the poor well. We at New Hope, I lived with a lot of refugees, and a lot of refugees moved to our neighborhood. And I often recognize that they're have a hard time finding jobs because they don't speak English, and because they grew up in refugee camps, they don't have many skills. So I've always wanted to create a business where we could employ our neighborhood friends, the refugee neighbors who came. And these are people from Burma again. These are Karen refugees. And so we tutor them in our home, and we've supported a Karen church. But again, we saw a lot of them were working under the table, not making much money. And then what happened was that I heard that one company called Imperfect Produce needed people to pack the produce. They take imperfect produce, ones that they couldn't sell in the stores, but are still good to eat, and then they box them up and sell them to people. And they needed people to pack the food. And so I found one Burmese Christian man who could speak the language, and he used his time and his ability to speak the language to contact the refugees. And the refugees were really afraid to work outside of the Burmese restaurant enclave, but one brave refugee took one of these jobs. And these jobs pay more than minimum wage, pay health insurance, and you get extra food that the others don't want. So once one refugee got the job through this Burmese Christian, others also began to work in the Imperfect Produce. It worked so well that Imperfect Produce hired a dozen or so of the Burmese in the communities, and then Imperfect Produce expanded to Portland and to Chicago. And so when they expanded to those sites, these refugees told their friends in those cities to also work for Imperfect Produce. So I think this is just way that we were able to use our gifts of hospitality and stewardship, that I was able to connect them to this industry. The Burmese Christian who was on sick leave was able to devote his time and care. And then the Burmese refugees themselves were able to work for their family and take care of their family. And now it's happened in 3 cities. So for me, this is again, God's providence, God's gift. Again, I just happened to be there to connect, and then everybody else stewarded their gifts, their gifts of foreign language, their gifts of wanting to take care of their family, to bring justice to the community. And finally, for us, especially those of us who've grown up here and maybe have more insider perspectives, maybe we grew up here and we could speak the language. Maybe we grew up here and we got education in the US. Maybe we are from here and we're in higher positions of corporate power. It's easier for us to then now buy into the American dream and be part of it. And that's sort of dangerous because we adopt and we're seduced by the power of the world. But I guess I could tell you one quick example. I've been working a lot on trying to protect Asian elderly, and I'm getting a lot of media attention or interviews. And I mean, I told you this story. An Asian grandma that I was supposed to bring dinner to, but I totally forgot grandma because I was so busy talking to the press. So that's the allure. There's all this attention I could get from mainstream media, but then I forget those around me. And so that's the danger of being enamored by becoming an insider rather than staying as an outsider. But as an outsider, who we can abstain from sinful desires which wage war against the soul. Daniel and his friends migrated to Babylon and adopted the language, adopted the education, adopted even their names. So I have a Chinese name, but you call me Russell all the time. But they abstained from eating from the emperor's table. They abstained from sinful desires, the lure of power, the lure of status, the lure of looking good. And I know for myself that I'm super attracted to getting attention from people who are powerful, from getting close to the fame or close to the wealth of people. But the more we see, oh no, we don't belong here. We're foreigners and exiles to this land. That could distance us. It gives us a perspective. We could say, what the world has to offer is far short than what God has to offer. That even the wealth and power and status that the best of America has can give, God's kingdom has so much more grace and love and ways of being that it helps us to abstain from sinful desires. So, Bread of Life, don't claim this world. Stay apart, stay distant. Realize, wow, America may have a lot of opportunity, but it has a lot of poverty. America may offer freedom, but it has a lot of discrimination. America may be really powerful, but it doesn't use that power well all the time. So use your foreigner perspective to stay a distance from this world and critique it, because that critique enables us to abstain from sinful desires. Overall, we may be foreigners and strangers to the world, but we are no longer foreigners and strangers to God, but instead fellow citizens and with God's people, members of his household. So we have a different citizenship as we claim our foreignerness, even though it's a lowly status in the world's eyes, and even though we're tempted to try to become more American in order to fit in order to avoid racism, fitting in may not be all that is so great, but rather we need to neither try to buy into the system, but instead identify with God's kingdom and with God's citizens. To close, I want to ask you, citizenship means that you belong. And citizenship in heaven means we belong with God in heaven. We have a whole different value system. We have a whole different way of life. We have a whole different, even government. And my question to you as we close is, where do you want to fit in? Do you want to fit into America and the American dream? Or do you want to fit into God's kingdom and its riches of grace? Where do you want to belong? Do you want to belong to America that discriminates, that treats its elderly so harshly, America that has so much crime? Or do you want to belong to a kingdom of peace and justice? And ask yourself finally, how can we be hospitable? Knowing that we were once foreigners, how can we have empathy and hospitality and invite foreigners and strangers into God's household? Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we mourn over the hard times that Asian Americans face themselves at this time. We mourn for how our elderly are attacked and mistreated. We grieve the system that frames us as outsiders, so much so that people could abuse us and scream at us. But we know that those who are persecuted will receive your solace. Those who are persecuted will receive your justice. That if we embrace this foreigner status, even though it's lowly, you can take that and make it a gift. You can take our foreigner status and grace us with citizenship in heaven so that we could have empathy for others, that we could show hospitality for others, and that we could seek justice for others. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Jung, for sharing with us how we can find our security in our heavenly citizenship and even leverage that for God's purposes here in this world. Let's close our session now with a song that reminds us that our firm foundation is built on Christ alone. Hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest spring, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When darkness veils his lovely face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. His oath, his covenant, his blood support me in the whelming flood. When all around my soul gives way, he then is all my hope and stay. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. Shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ
Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon. We'll see you tomorrow morning for our fourth and final session of our Missions Emphasis Weekend. We hope to see you at 9:15 tomorrow. Have a great rest of today.